why doesn't someone toss a question at me? And I'll be happy to come up with my thoughts and based on my centuries of experience.
So I have a question.
Okay.
So for new writers like myself, I'm generally literate, but I know I tend to make a lot of just small mistakes. Mistakes that aren't necessarily as critical when I do public speaking because it just gets brushed over, but people visually pay attention. And these are small things like having my tense corrected, or having tense consistent, or plurality consistent, or small things like that. Are there tools that you recommend, whether to teach myself better writing or to help correct it, other than Grammarly? And I rule out Grammarly because as a cybersecurity guy, I know they capture the entire content and I don't like them having access to all my content. Are there any other tools that you can recommend to improve my abilities or to analyze what I'm writing?
Yeah. I think there's one tool that's really invaluable, and it's for experts as well as beginners. And that is to take whatever you've written and put it in a drawer for a day or two, and then take it out again and look at it with fresh eyes. Because by the time you finish writing something, the words are really, they've carved grooves in your brain and you're sort of flowing along those grooves. You don't really see the errors. So you have to look at it with fresh eyes. And I can tell you it's as true for me as it is for any beginner. And I have to say it's the single most important, it's the single most common mistake that people make. I do not exempt myself from that. If I look at something a day after I've done it, I'm kind of horrified at the little things I find. Now, I have to tell you that if someone is pitching me and their material is full of those errors, I'm inclined to not really be very excited about what they're pitching me. But if I get a piece of copy in from a good writer and I see those errors, it'll piss me off, but it doesn't really disincline me to the piece. I don't think they're important. They're only important as a measure of sloppiness and inattentiveness and not really caring about one's work. So, and there's, when you're reading for sense and or writing for sense or writing for rhythm, it takes a completely different mindset to catch the typos and the little errors of tense that don't really have a major effect on the telling of ideas, but they should be corrected. And you only can catch them by putting the piece away for a while. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Nobody has any more questions?
I have one. What is the thing that you look for most with a brand new writer? What would you say that there's okay grammar, that a person has looked over it a couple of times, but what is the main thing you're looking for?
I'm looking for someone to tell me something I haven't heard before. And it could be either the information is new, but mostly it's a new perspective. It's a new way of looking at the same old stuff. I'm looking for and someone whose language is fresh, whose language conveys a fresh perspective. When I get that, I mean, there could be all the grammar mistakes in the world. I just sit back and feel like I'm going on this great little trip, and someone's taking me there. That's what most excites me. That the fresh eye, and it could be in the language, it could be in what they, in the story they're telling me, the bits of the story that light up the narrative, that create a spark of interest. That I'm always appreciative of that. Don't always get it. Sometimes I get bits of it. Sometimes I'll add more if the writer kind of spurs me to invention. And sometimes I'll just plain go about adding it from scratch sometimes, if a topic is, it kind of lends itself to that. But that's what I most look for. I remember once when I was the health editor at Family Circle magazine. This was in the 80s, and a wonderful writer from the Wall Street Journal did a piece for me. It was like a bread and butter piece. It must have been February. It was Heart Month. I had him do a piece on the heart, for which I paid him probably, believe it or not, in the 1980s, $10,000 for a 1,500 word article, which is just an outrageous sum of money then, and particularly outrageous now. Nobody pays writers like that. And I wasn't expecting much, although I should have, from this writer. And I just started the article, and I mean, he wrote about a tired subject, how the heart works, with such vivid and fresh prose that it was just a pleasure to behold. And so any subject can be brought to life by the language.
I have another question. If a person is, I have two questions actually, and I'll just put them both out there at the same time.
I just want to say something about my last statement. A good exercise for every writer is to use the thesaurus, and online it is so easy to do. You can just keep it open online and plug in a word as you need it. And if I'm opening the thesaurus, I'll write satisfaction, comma, synonyms. That'll be my Google search, and I'll get to this thesaurus. And what happens is not that you're just looking for a word, but the words that are there, some are quite right, some are not quite right. They stimulate you to think. So if used the right way, the thesaurus becomes, it helps you clarify your thinking, and it stimulates your thinking, and it's kind of fun because it, at the same time, it instructs you in all the different facets of meaning of any one word, of any one sentence. And you may even want to take the word off in a completely different direction. It may suggest other ideas to you. So you can be creative and use a thesaurus. It really does build freshness into anyone's writing, including professionals. And I'm sorry, Debbie, I interrupted your question.
Well, I'm sorry to anyone if I'm jumping in with so many questions. Please just unmute yourselves at any time and take over from my question asking. My first question is, there must need to be a good editor-writer fit, much like with a psychologist, right? How does one go about finding the right editor?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. and I just think it's happens by happenstance. I know that there are writers I just love working with, and when we work together, I mean, just really good things happen. And what writers loosen up, allow the editor to do more. The editor can suggest stuff to the writer. There's a freedom of articulation of ideas and words that flows back and forth. And I just think, I don't think you can, I don't know that there are any signs in advance of someone who is going to be that person for you. There has to be great trust between an editor and a writer. And I have writers with whom I just have that experience, and a lot, I have to say, I have a lot. And maybe more now than I ever did, because I'm more relaxed and free about what I do, and I'm not looking for my glory. I'm always looking to help people sound good and look good on a page or on a screen. And when people understand that and don't take every word from an editor as criticism, I think it really depends on, I think that there are elements on both sides of that interaction in both people that facilitate that kind of beautiful fit. I mean, there has to be a writer who doesn't get hostile and see every improvement as a correction or as a criticism of what they've done, but seeing it as someone who's pulling for them, pulling the thoughts, helping to pull the thoughts and the words out of their head. And editors have to, in a way, be cheerleaders for the writers they work with, or kind of get in and get inside. When you read, one of the things I like to do was when I read something, when I get something, I sit back and read it. I'm on the writer's journey, and you get inside their way of telling the story. And I make the assumption it's going to work until it proves that it doesn't work. And so the editor has to be able to do that, not come at a piece with a very fixed idea of how it should be. And there has to be some opening on the writer's side. So that's part of what facilitates that interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That was really helpful. Thank you. I've been really asking all the questions. I'm gonna let someone else ask one.
Hi, I'm going to jump in and ask a question. First of all, I wanted to totally agree with you about the thesaurus experience. I have my thesaurus open, and I actually was, up to this point, I was ashamed of the fact that I like the companionship of my thesaurus. Even if I don't always use the recommended words, it just feels like a sounding board when I write. So I really enjoy what you had to say about that. But my question to you is, for people who haven't worked with an editor, can you tell us a little bit what the process is like from the pitch to the completion of the piece?
Okay, that's a good question. So the pitch, the pitch is so important. And I mean, we could spend hours on the pitch. And the pitch really has to grab the editor's attention in just a short amount of time as possible. I mean, most editors like me get more pitches than they can pay attention to. And if something starts off with some fresh words and grabs my attention in some way, it's about something interesting or arouses my curiosity, I'm going to pay attention. There are lots of other things that have to get on. It's got to answer a lot of questions really quickly. It's got to persuade me that the writing is good enough so that the writer should be the one who tells the story. There's got to be a sense of urgency. Why would I want to commission that article now? Yeah, this is a good idea, but I have a finite amount of space. And I need to have a reason for devoting space, whether it's online or on paper, to this idea right now. So those are the elements. It has to be concise. I would not want it to be dense, but all the skill that the writer has to go into the pitch. And by the way, the pitch usually requires that you do some research into a topic or have some really fascinating handle on a topic, or have a very special reason for doing a profile on a particular person, depending on the kind of story that you're promoting. And you've got to be charming, and you kind of got to persuade me why it's important to get this story out and why now. And that you're a master of the ability to tell this story, whether it's a narrative, whether it's a science story. The two are not mutually exclusive either. So the pitch will capture the editor's attention. And there could be great pitches that get declined, that get refused. And I really feel bad about that. But so getting a rejection on a pitch is not necessarily a sign of a bad idea. There just can be lots of forces that come together to not make it right for that editor on that publication to assign that article at that moment. And it could be things that have nothing to do with the writer, things that could be internal to the website or the publication. And when I say publication, I mean either online or in print. There are just 1,000,005 ideas, so one should not take no for an answer. Unfortunately, lots of editors don't take the time to get back to a writer, so that a pitch letter just lands in limbo and never gets a response, which is pretty rude. I have to confess, I'm sometimes guilty of it. I try not to be. I can't say that things don't fall through the cracks. I get hundreds of emails a day, and some things just get to the bottom of my email in basket and they're off the page, and I don't really see them again until someone sends me another note and says, hey, did you get my pitch? So there are a lot of reasons why a good pitch is a bad idea right at the particular time that it lands. But let's assume that the editor likes the pitch. Then there begins a negotiation. And I won't talk about the negotiation of money or due date. I mean, those are things you can find out about elsewhere. But there comes a negotiation of how the publication sees the article and wants to present it. And every publication, other than a blog, which usually has the blogger's voice, and usually does not require a pitch letter, but every other curated publication usually has a perspective or a reason for telling that story. And the editor should be conveying that to the writer. It sometimes happens that the way, so now we're getting into the angle and the slant that a publication may want the writer to take. And that's a negotiation. And I have to say, in all fairness, that the editor and the writer may not see eye to eye on that. I remember once getting a call from, I won't mention the name. The editor is now a major editor at the Times, but she was not at the Times at the time. She was on one of the major, a major magazine. And she called me and asked me if I would do an article on stress during pregnancy and the possibility of stress hormones influencing sex hormones, possibly biasing the brain in some behavioral ways. And the irony is I got calls from 3 editors at that publication at the same time to do that story, really a hot idea. And I had to dissuade them from doing the article because the studies were really only done in mice and the results were a little distressing about possibly biasing sex hormones to influence behavior in ways that people might or might not accept. And I really didn't want to overpromise on the basis of mouse studies. These studies, by the way, are still in contention. It's still a stream of research. But so I simply said, hey guys, I just don't think this one's ready for prime time. Let's work out something else. And that happens. If you've ever, I mean, I remember doing stuff for Vogue and Glamour where they, blindly, you had to do they didn't really even care about the topic, but this is just a classic one. They had to do a diet story every single month. And now I can't remember whether it was Vogue or Harper's Bazaar. And the editor called me and said, want you to do an article on the biofeedback diet. And I just thought about it and I thought, well, yeah, there's a great biofeedback diet. You get on the scale, it says you weigh too much, and you get the hell off the scale and you tape your mouth shut. And this was just not, I don't think this was what they wanted, but the editor had promoted a cover line and wanted a cover line on the biofeedback diet. And I just had to decline. I said, I'm not going to deliver it to you because I can't in good conscience write that story. And I didn't. I did get other assignments from them, but not that one. So, you know, there's always a negotiation, and the writer may or may not want to go down a path that the preconceived path that the editor has, although most good editors don't have preconceived paths. And then good writers, if they get the commission for the article, if they uncover surprising or controversial information, I mean, it's usually a good thing to just drop a little note to the editor and say, hey, this stuff is really fascinating. And it's really good to inform the editor that way, because one, it could increase the importance of the article, and the editor may want to give the article more attention online or in the publication, may want to make it a cover story, may want to put more resources into it, or it just may influence the art that might be commissioned to accompany the article. Or if it's, you know, surprising and controversial information, the editor may say, okay, it's a little surprising, but why don't you get confirmation from 2 or 3 other sources on that piece of information, and sort of beef up that statement and the supporting information around it in the developing article. So there are a lot of ways a piece of information could influence the article. The thing you don't want to do, you want to surprise the editor in a very positive way. You don't want to surprise an editor in a negative way, saying, oh, wow, this is not the story I was expecting. Do that, guaranteed you won't get a good reception, because the editor just won't know what to do with it. Remember, an editor has usually promised his or her editor-in-chief something about that article, and plans have been made to position it in the publication. So nobody really wants negative surprises. Always keep an editor informed. I don't know whether I've answered your question fully, but if I haven't.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah. And if there are more aspects of that question that I haven't answered, don't hesitate to ask.
I do. So if a person gives an editor a pitch, right? And the editor says, you know what, I like it. Then walk us down the path of what happens from that point on.
So what happened, so the editor says, I like it. Okay, let me go into, so I would then have a conversation with my editor-in-chief. And it depends. I'm assuming this is going to be a feature article. Devote some space to the telling of this story. So any publication has plans for an issue, whether it's for that day or that week or that month. As a magazine at Psychology Today, I'm working on a 4-month lead time, which will bounce out over the course of time to 2 months. So there's always a lot of planning. So any one good pitch that I might like has to be right. If I want it and there's an urgency to doing it, it's got to work somehow with the rest of the article, feature articles that are in planning for that issue. Or if it's really so strong an article, it just might be the deciding piece, and everything else has to work around that. But usually it's got to be coordinated so that a magazine doesn't want 2 articles roughly on analogous topics. So that's when a pitch is liked. And if I get a pitch in immediately and I like it, immediately, before I even talk to anybody else, I will just shoot a note back to the writer and say, I like this pitch. Let me think about things to do with it. I'll get back to you. If you don't hear from me in a few days, don't be afraid to give me an uts. Because as I said, I'm inundated with stuff, and in the crush of things, something can fall off my radar that is really important that I do want to pay attention to. So I cognitively offload some of the responsibility to the writer, who, after all, has a vested interest in seeing that I do something with his or her pitch. So there's planning that has to go into it. And I might get back to the writer and I might say, tell me a little bit more. Who would you talk to? How would you do this article? Who might you contact? What's your involvement in this information? So I might ask a lot of questions about that. And if I want to put it on the fast track, let's say for the next issue, I'll say, how clear is your plate? Are you ready to jump on this? And I need to know that the writer can meet a deadline that works for both of us. So those are the major things that I will consider right away. And then my job is to persuade my editor. I've been the editor-in-chief, and now I'm editor at large. I stepped back several years ago when I wrote my second book, and I've always liked the title of editor at large. It kind of gives me a leeway, a certain amount of leeway. But I do have access to the ear of the editor-in-chief, and she will listen very carefully to what I recommend. I have ideas that don't always resonate with the editor-in-chief. It took me a year to persuade the editor-in-chief that we should do an article on physician suicide. It's more than suicide, burnout, suicide, the sort of spectrum of pain, from depression to burnout to moral injury and suicide. It's a major feature. It's going to be coming out in the next week. But it took me a year to get the editor-in-chief to understand what an important topic it was. And I don't think I was even the deciding factor. I think she saw a book that was coming out by a physician on suicide, and it reminded her that I had this idea. And immediately I just went down that path of that idea. It's one of my favorite articles I've done in a very long time. But not every idea that I like is going to persuade the editor-in-chief. And by the way, if I get in a good idea from a writer and it can wait a little bit, I will tell the writer, sit tight, I'm your cheerleader. I know we'll do this. I can't persuade the editor-in-chief right now, but I'm working on it. I don't know how other editors work. I'm not sure that they're so married to good ideas all the time. But I think they're good editors who keep folders of good ideas that they'd like to do. Although I always tell a writer that if you get an opportunity to pitch it somewhere else sooner, let me know. And you see, there's trust there, and it shows the writer that I'm on his or her side. So that's part of what creates a great working relationship. So you can begin to see that there are a lot of factors that have to be in place for any one article to go through at any one time. Has that even approximated an answer to your question?
Go ahead and jump in, Joel.
I have a question, Hara, unless the person wants to follow up.
Go ahead, Joel.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you heard me. So we're talking a lot about pitches,
Right.
pitches to editors, but I'd like to know what the differentiation is between these three roles I'm going to ask you about, because it seems to me that I pitch to the publisher. I'm not sure that there's a difference. What's the difference between an editor, an agent, and a publisher in terms of a pitch?
Oh, okay. Depends what you're doing. Are you talking about a book?
Either a book or a magazine article, either or.
Okay. So let's take a book and let's take an article separately, okay? A book, for the most part, it depends. If the book is slotted for public consumption, basically you have to have an agent. So you have to pitch to an agent and get an agent to take on your idea, and the agent markets the idea to editors. And in the book world, editors then persuade the publisher. They have meetings in which they pitch to the publisher. And an editor who feels very strongly about an idea can be very persuasive, even to a reluctant publisher. So that's, so a book will go to an agent, or in the academic world, there are books that go directly to the publisher. You have to persuade the publisher. I'm not too familiar exactly with how books are promoted to publishers in the academic world. I usually deal with people who've written academic books and then realize they've got a public-facing book on their hands, really with just a little bit of work. And sometimes they're actively pursued by a publisher or a house, let's say a house like Norton, which has a professional and a trade publishing division, might see both sides at the same time. Most times publishers don't. And you need an agent for that book to get to the trade. Trade means public in the book world. An article is really very different. An article does not need an agent. You pitch an editor. And the publisher does not play a role in it usually. It's the editor who decides. The editor and the publisher on a publication generally have two different roles, referred to as church and state. They don't talk. The publisher is on the business side. The editor is on the article side. Only jokingly do I say they don't talk, but usually one does not seek permission from the other. So that for articles, it goes to the editor, and for books, it either goes to an agent or publisher. Joel, have I helped you understand that a little better?
Yeah, I have one follow-up, if that's okay. So
Go
what
ahead.
happens
Sure.
for articles is if you look up a publication, a magazine,
A
They,
magazine or a journal?
say again, no, journals I know, unfortunately.
Okay.
Um, so a magazine, you look one up. I'll make it up. Let's say it's the Atlantic or the New Yorker. They will say, if you want to submit an article, you know, right here and right, and you never meet anybody, I guess, unless they like the idea. So I just didn't understand how that process worked. You kind of like submit something blind. I have no clue who it goes to. I
No.
have no clue how it's judged. And then you're either ignored or told, you know, we want to talk to you further.
Mhm.
And I'm just not understanding what goes on inside the black box, so to speak.
Okay, and that's for writers who don't already have some kind of working relationship with an editor, who's never worked with an editor there before, either there or at another publication before. So yeah, it does. It goes into a big pile of submissions, and one hopes that someone with a certain amount of intelligence goes through that pile. And I'm sure that someone does. But you're right, Joel, you don't know who you're pitching to. And that could be a disadvantage, but it's all the more reason why you want your pitch to really grab somebody and be persuasive. And it just leaps out at an editor who says, hey, I've got to follow up this pitch. I want to talk to this writer, find out a little bit more, how deeply they see into the idea, how well they see into the idea, whether they can carry it out, whether they have a time frame on which they could carry it out, if indeed we decide we want it. But yeah, I have to agree with you. It's a very discouraging process to write into a black hole. It doesn't bring out the best in any writer, and yet it requires the best from a writer, because you've got to excite someone who's going through about 30 submissions at a moment, and they're just looking for something to make their heart skip a beat.
Yep, you've answered it well, I think, and I assume for you, you don't have unsolicited manuscripts. You know
We
that
do.
you do. Okay.
Oh yeah. I do get unsolicited manuscripts. That's the worst thing anybody could do, is send in a manuscript, a completed manuscript. I'm glad you brought that up. So the unsolicited manuscript. Number one, no editor I know of has time to read an entire manuscript beforehand to decide whether the topic is worth an article. That's number one. Number two, an editor may like the topic of an unsolicited manuscript, but may feel that it should be approached in a way that bears discussion with the writer, and may even have some ideas, him or herself, about people who should be contacted. So for any number of reasons, I would never suggest anyone send in a manuscript unsolicited. You can have a manuscript that you finished, but send in a pitch letter. And all the better that the manuscript is finished, because that should give you a really good grasp of your topic, and you can manipulate the way you see that to make it sparkle in a pitch letter. You know the ending, you know some elements of the story that are exciting. Lead with those in your pitch letter. There's no formula for a pitch letter. Just grab the editor's attention some way. So never ever send in that unsolicited manuscript. And supposing you write a pitch letter, supposing you've got a manuscript that you've done, and you send in a pitch letter, and the editor is really interested in what you're pitching, and there'll be a conversation. The editor doesn't really want to, at that point, okay, I can only speak for myself. If someone says to me, you know, I've already written something, and I'll say, at that point, I will say, send it to me, because I'm now already interested in the topic. And I will look at the manuscript, hoping it's not 100 pages long. And more often than not, I will call up the writer or shoot the writer an email and say, you know, read this manuscript. These are the elements of it that appeal to me. Would you be willing to write a piece that focuses on A, B, J, and Z, and looks at it in a certain context? In other words, the manuscript would be like a piece of source material that persuades me that something's there, but I would still want it carved out differently. And I'm not saying my way of seeing the information is correct. I'm just simply saying that's the way that I see that idea as being the most exciting way of being presented for my purposes at psychology today, or that I think is most fascinating, or is most novel, or that delivers insights about the topic or about the culture that have not been overexposed before.
Thanks, Hara. That was very helpful.
Good. So don't send me an unsolicited manuscript unless I say, hey, I'll take a look at that piece. Will someone please stump me?
Want to be stumped? I can stump you.
Okay, I'll mute myself.
Okay, Hara, you've challenged me to stump you.
Okay.
So I want to say, this is hypothetical. I actually don't have this, but I want to send you something. How am I going to grab your attention? You've told me there's no formula. What am I going to do? Am I going to tell you an autobiographical story? Am I going to send you a picture of me frolicking on the beach? What's going to grab you?
What's going to grab me is the quality of the sentences that you construct, a piece of information. If it's a profile of somebody, might be delivering me some quirky little piece of information about someone because he's the single most important person in the field of evolutionary psychology, and that grabs my attention. There's no formula, Joel, but it's a piece of writing, it's a piece of information, it's a perspective, it's a piece of knowledge. The people are exploring the way this would have been 10 years ago. People are exploring the way the gut changes the brain. Something in there, phrased felicitously, would have grabbed my attention. As I said, I feel like I'm at a loss for words, but there is no one formula, but it's got to be done in a sentence or two. And the deeper you know your topic, and the more about it that you know and have some little sparkling gem of information about it, that's what I suggest you lead with in your pitch letter, and immediately relate it to the entire topic and why it's important, and do it in as few words as possible, in as charmingly a way as possible.
So Hara, charm is subjective. Can you give
Yeah.
us some ideas on how to objectify your charm when you're writing?
So, well, I don't think charm is totally subjective. The words are lively and lift off the page. You know, if you find yourself using words over and over again, like make or use, those are just dead words. You find exact synonyms in that area.
Wait, can you give us a list of dead words? I didn't know there was a list
You
of
know,
dead
it's
words.
like there's no, those common shapeless verbs. There's always a verb that can be given power and charm. When I say charm, you want to hit the senses. It's like getting a fresh and novel taste in your mouth. That's what you want to deliver with words. You want to make the words sort of dance. They're not the words that you hear every second of every day. You want them more piquant, more sharper, more able to strike a nerve ending, to be sharper and not be a blunt force, but you know, a tweak, to a little fizz of a nerve ending, a fresh word, freshly stated, a thought, a new piece of information that you likely haven't heard before. Those are elements of charm. And I think that every editor would agree that there's charm in the freshness of the way something is worded. If I knew that you were going to ask that question, I probably would have looked for examples of things that just lay flat like a dead fish on the page, or that just fizzed and excited a nerve ending and caught my attention and just sparkled in their own right. And that brings me to make another point, and that is that a writer who does that may pitch an article that I don't want or can't use or have already done. Oh, very often I get pitched ideas that are already in the pipeline, and I can't use them. But I make a note of that writer and I say, oh boy, here's a writer that I'd like to assign something to, because this writer persuades me that he or she can handle information in a lively and interesting way and get the information across, but it kind of like dances a little bit on the page. but I didn't have the advance notice, so I didn't pick out examples of dead on arrival and live on arrival.
Can you put that on for next week?
Yes.
I'd love that. That'd be helpful.
Very exciting.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to put on the docket for Hara for next week? Something that she can prepare?
Oh yeah, that would be fun. Yeah.
Just so you know, you can send in any piece of writing. If you send it in advance, you can send it to info@mentorproject.org, and it'll get to me, and I can get it to Hara. If you're able to do that, I can make sure that she has it ahead of time, and she can take a look at your article and then do an edited version of at least a part of that and show us all what it looks like next week.
Yeah, just make sure it's not too long a manuscript, because I am busy. I'm one of the great, very fortunate people to be exceedingly busy at a time when too many people don't have work. I am forever grateful that I am busy. I am most appreciative of it. And it's a really intense time work-wise for us today, right now too. So.
Is it a time that, are people submitting a lot of material right now? Are people producing a lot of material?
So are you talking about for Psychology Today or for other publications, or?
Yeah, in general, in the writer's world, is there a lot of?
I mean, yes and no. I think that, I think we've all been, I think this radical shift in our activity is a challenge that some people have met by shifting their own gears. It's caused a lot of us to go inside and think. It does pose some existential challenges, and that's forced some people to think and maybe even to write. And I think that's a welcome thing. I'm getting a slightly increased number of pitches. I wouldn't say grandly increased number of pitches. What is happening is that the Psych Today website has been overwhelmed. I mean, we have a lot of bloggers, and they are all activating and blogging right now. So there's a lot of stuff happening on the website, which is different to some degree different from what goes into the magazine. I may see a great idea on the website that'll spark an idea for something in the magazine. So this, a lot of people are reacting to the availability of time by using it as an opportunity to write, or because they've been sort of forced to think about things that they might not have thought about before. And so that's encouraging them to write too. So I'm noticing, as I said, slight uptick in pitches, but a huge flood on the website. I don't know. I'm assuming it's pretty much the same elsewhere. There are all these people who think, oh, if only I had 5 minutes, I would really love to sit down and write something. And now a lot of people have those 5 minutes, and it's sort of that moment of truth. Some people will never write it. They like to think that they will, and some people actually take the time and do it, and good for them.
Are you seeing more blogs that are coronavirus related? And is that something that you should avoid, jumping on the bandwagon with something that's happening right away when everyone else is on the same bandwagon? Or should you be looking to put out something different?
You know, Debbie, you've really hit on a really interesting question, because yes, there's just a ton of stuff on coronavirus. And so the bar is pretty high to say something novel and new. And yet, you know, there was a blog post this morning that I liked, where it was actually a therapist, a cognitive and behavioral therapist, who said, hey, where have all the patients gone? And it was kind of a charming blog post saying that, hey, this is a kind of therapy that requires, that thrives on real life examples for the discussion between patient and therapist. And right now, real life isn't happening for anybody, for most people. Their lives are radically curtailed. So there's a lot less content to work with in therapy sessions. So either sessions are shorter or just not happening. I thought, hey, that's really kind of novel. So there's never, when there's too much of a topic, the bar is even higher to be novel, have a novel perspective, to speak in a more interesting way about the topic, but it's not off limits. And yes, there are a lot of blog posts about coronavirus, and not all of them are novel and interesting, but some are. Some have a very fresh insight, or there are many, many, many aspects to the situation that we're in right now, and lots of people are coping in lots of different ways. So there is a long list of things to think about and talk about, although very often a lot of people talk about the same 5 ways to cope with the boredom, and you've read all those 5 things 25 times, but there are novel aspects. It just raises the bar for originality and freshness of the idea. I can't tell you how many times I get in from people, they're wanting to tell me the story of their depressive episode and overcoming depression. I don't want to belittle people's efforts, because I think it's really important that people write their way out of it if they can. But not everything that people write about is meant for public consumption. Journaling, keeping a journal or having a private stash of writing is really important. It's really important for everyone to be able to articulate their own experience. That does not necessarily mean that one's own personal experience has value for the broader general public. Although there was a time when I was putting out a newsletter on depression, and even still now, I would get at least 20 pitches a week for my story of overcoming depression, and without belittling any one of them, because each one is momentous for each person. But you have to look outside yourself and realize that what was momentous for me and enabled me to get my life back on track, maybe something that other people have realized before me. But sometimes that person could have a larger insight that would have application to a large audience.
I want to thank you, Hara. This was a really enlightening hour. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. And I just want to let everyone know we're going to be doing this every week. So if you have questions for Hara, feel free to email them in advance, info@mentorproject.org. You can also save them for next week as well and present them. So I'm hoping that this will be a rich dialogue each week. And I have a feeling that some of you will leave here today and have a bunch of questions that will crop up. And so just write them down so that you can remember them for next week. Same time and same link. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.